Sega once owned the console market, with its most popular console outside of Japan in the Megadrive / Genesis. Now, what made it so exciting and popular was just how edgy and unique it was from the competition, delivering more grown-up teenage titles rather than family-friendly focused ones. This was during the arcade heyday, with so many games and genres being born from the brethren of Taito, Capcom, Irem, and of course Sega themselves. Now, around the early 80s, a new formula was emerging which replaced lasers and swords with feet and fists. This relatively short-lived genre was inspired, like millions of us, by Bruce Lee when he exploded onto the martial arts scene and changed it forever. Now, Irem's Kung Fu Master in 1984 was Bruce Lee's unfinished Game of Death in arcade form. Working your way up the pagoda by dodging daggers and duffing dudes, this cross-inspiration from movies has continued ever since and laid the groundwork for the almighty Renegade that took the arcade and home computer market hostage at the time. So many 8-bit and 16-bit delights from this one. It created the urban isometric beat-em-up we all know today, but it took most of its inspiration from the Walter Hill classic brawler in The Warriors, down to the 70s graffiti's art, tribal colours, baseball bats and subways. Maybe not fighting in toilets, but it went as close as it could. This is still an enjoyable and stylish film, and if you haven't, I urge you to watch it when you can. Now, many years later, Double Dragon carried the torch and was atop the beat-em-up bell curve that saw a huge impact in arcades and later every home format going. Now, with Sega having feet in both arcade and home markets, it had a wealth of titles to pick from, but this did not easily include the competition. Now, as Nintendo were late to the 16-bit party and infamously forced all developers to adhere to unscrupulous rules to artificially restrict games on Sega machines, Capcom were enjoying huge success with its Final Fight title that was intended as the Street Fighter follow-up. They were secured as a key partner for Nintendo, and with Final Fight being one of the two big arcade exclusives ported from arcades in 1989, it was hot property indeed, itself being the next big leap in the beat-em-up journey. Now, although the Super Nintendo version was cut down with the loss of Guy, less characters, and obviously a restriction on lots of enemies, it was still a big title for Nintendo, and Sega could not utilise the very different licensing rules back then to make its own version, which it later did on the better Mega CD port. Now, the next best thing to do was to do what they do best: roll your own. Just like Sonic was a Mario killer and Columns was its Tetris, Streets of Rage was Sega's Final Fight adversary. It was almost a year after Final Fight landed on the Super Nintendo in Japan, but the focus was all about that vital Western market, where beat-em-ups were much bigger and more popular, and it beat it by a good few months in the same year of 1991. This took a great deal of wind out of Nintendo's sails, as Streets was all the rage. Now, the game itself was an impressive mid-gen looker, smooth scrolling and enjoyable beat-em-up no doubt. Excellent use of colour, strong neon-based lighting and the shadow silhouette of the city skyline ever present within its urban sprawl. The biggest weakness though was its small sprites, and due to its hurried development phase, 30Hz refresh rate. The main reason behind this cost was the fact the game was marketed to beat Final Fight by having far more characters on screen, and therefore this came at the sacrifice of the timescales they had. But what really set this apart and raised it as a massive hit was the incredible soundtrack that was built on the most popular emerging music of the time: house. Now, Yuzo Koshiro was a genius in utilizing the Yamaha sound chip with combinations of frequency modulation, single channel samples, and even the PSG chip, which generated sounds that embellished the game with its signature fast and catchy dance beats, and even trance moody melodies. The first game being house scene based, and the second was far more techno style. It was an evolution of the early 80s electronic soundtrack, created by the mighty bands as Depeche Mode, Kraftwerk, Human League, and many, many others. House music was started in Chicago and then later onto London, Detroit, all of these very urban cities. That was something all of us from the late 80s and 90s recall fondly. Now, the drum-based high-energy beats really get your foot stomping and head nodding. In clubs, these really got the atmosphere through the roof, and this was a perfect mix to ramp up games with that type of energy. If you were gaming on the consoles back then you will recall we spent days of our time in the sound menu to listen to all the game's BGMs and sound effects. In fact, I had mine hooked up to my hi-fi in my bedroom, and as such I used it to play just Streets of Rage, among others, on my hi-fi just to listen to while doing other stuff. It really was a leap in game soundtracks over the chip tunes before it, with the Megadrive being almost a synthesizer in itself from its FM sound chip. It fitted perfectly with Koshiro's styles and skills, focused on his own sound driver and replication of the Roland 808 rhythm machine that was the heart of the house music style it replicated, and it merged the two mediums long before Sony took it mainstream in Wipeout. Now, as impressive as it was, the sequel is the star of the series and one of the best games of the 16-bit era, let alone the Genesis. Back when the second and third gen titles were not a known thing, with teams getting more used to the hardware and squeezing more out of it, Streets of Rage 2 took the first game and ramped it up to 16 megabit. A 16 megabit cartridge was used, and it squeezed more out of the now 4-year-old hardware, and it was becoming much harder to do this. But not for this brand new team, which was outsourced by Sega under the strong influence of Sega of America, as they understood the impact and sales that this game would bring. This new family company was Yuzo Koshiro's own. It was called Ancient, and believe it or not, this was their very first Mega Drive game, having cut their teeth only 1 year prior on the Game Gear version of Sonic the Hedgehog. This 1992 release was all done within a year, but it improved almost every single element of that first game. Led by Ayano, Yuzo's sister, as the artist and designer, her skills dramatically changed the quality and impact of the game, taking pop references everywhere, from roller skating for characters to Jean-Claude Van Damme on the art, to Street Fighter 2 with its dual option and combo-based combat. Sprites were doubled in size, even more enemies on screen, bigger and more varied levels, bosses, and both movesets, with all supers now being skill set based, from Axel's rising upper to Blaze's wheel kick. This meant even more animation frames, much meatier and varied sound effects, which included better quality samples and graphical flourishes. The first level is a recreation of the first game, but the 4 palettes of the Mega Drives are split into 2 to give sprites 2 sets to choose from, and the background gets the other 2 sets of 16. At times it looks like they had 4 times the palette from the first game, with the phenomenal use of blacks and the dedicated transparency colour across them all. Instead, they only had 4 times the memory thanks to that bigger ROM, the big benefit of all cartridge based systems really, as they are inline media with the system bus and CPU access. But it was the game's stunning graphical enhancements and flourishes, from the rain-soaked fight at the end, the final fight boss with their parallax raindrops falling over, spettling on the floor, that brilliant use of dark blues and blacks and lighter colours to illuminate the scene, and then everything just builds up into this back alley fight that really drove the impact of the title, along with that excellent techno soundtrack. Now the tunes were just as good, if not better overall. They still floored you with the synth heavy tracks being more techno now, and the remixed intro is as moody and invoking as ever. I really never get tired of listening to these tunes or playing this game. It is probably the highlight of the scrolling urban beat 'em up. The deep insights into the Streets of Rage 2 development process, which was less than a year, around 6 to 7 months, is really impressive. You can read it yourself in the link below from an interview from about 5 years ago from Ayano herself, talking about the details, the inspirations and the efforts and leaps they made to get the most out of the Megadrive, even comparisons to the Super Nintendo and the Megadrive in terms of how the screen and character and sprite limitations affect both machines. It's very interesting. You get visualizations of graphics in terms of the memory map system in the Megadrive using the old graph paper that all graphics were drawn to mix into that pixel art style. To other details such as the removal of the supers was also down to the fact it was necessitated by the vertical and diagonal scrolling that was now present, which wasn't in the original title. It's a very interesting read on one of the best games of the 16-bit era. The third game never made the same impact. Much of this was down to the fact that the genre was already on its last legs and winding its way down, with far more exciting new propositions coming around in 1993. The music was on nowhere near the same level, using pulse code modulation algorithms to generate the music automatically, and shockingly they weren't very good at all. Generally it doesn't do the job and it loses out on that impact the previous two titles had. It's also very similar to Streets of Rage 2, both in movesets, graphical layout and production. It's still an excellent beat 'em up and has loads of great points, longer levels, more characters, better movesets including the roll and that boosted super move that builds up and then gets fired off, which made it into Street Fighter 4. But this is where the Streets of Rage story lay dormant and dead for nigh on 25 years. Until now. Streets of Rage 4 has come about from a long gestation of development which has taken inspiration from that very same Streets of Rage 2 blog I just mentioned, even to the point where there is parts in the new game that were previously planned to be in Streets of Rage 2. You can see this on the layout design when they had an idea of a car crashing into the wall and then you fighting around it. Again, this is all coming from the Street Fighter influence at the times of development. They've put this into Streets of Rage 4. You now see this sequence happen in the first level, which is a genuine inspiration and mimic to the very first Streets of Rage 1 and Streets of Rage 2 title. And this tight balance of nostalgia that they have throughout the game is one of the most impressive elements of it. It really does deliver a careful balance of not ruining the old games, but paying homage to them in a level that works superbly throughout the title. Such as the special powers. In the first game you had the rocket from Axel that used to drive up, fire his rocket launcher and blow everything around the area. This is actually done in the new game on when the enemy boss battles uses it against you. And then throughout the game they use many options of the same pickups. You can actually change them in the menu, with vegan options being available, which is a bit crap, I'll be honest with you, just pathetic, but hey ho, that's the modern world we live in. And then there's other elements of the title where they've kept the artistry and the style of the clothing both of Axel and Blaze, and then the new characters are very reminiscent of the old. Adam makes an appearance in there, and there's loads of hidden extras and secrets, like playing the old levels with pixelized graphics and the enemies from back then on Streets of Rage 2 appearing in the title when you get to these bare knuckle arcade games, and you use an electrical source to get those going. That's the biggest hint I can probably give you if you want to find out how you get there. It's an exceptional homage to the original games without ruining that. And this inspiration but then improvement stems from all of the elements of the title. It's far more story focused, if very, very light, and these carry over into a comic book style, almost manga delivery of storylines. It's almost as if a mixture of Streets of Rage meets Comic Zone, another epic Megadrive title back in the day that was very, very impressive and looked exceptional. And this was also helped development by the likes of Mark Cerny, who everyone knows now for the Sony PlayStation and PS4 and PS5. Now the game itself mimics that kind of style by using these comic book fades and blends and movement to carry the story through, and those strong artistic styles that it used in the original Wonder Boy remake from a couple of years ago. And that French cel-shaded anime style is evident throughout the title, but even in the single player action, it keeps this core in terms of the cel-shaded sprite-based animation. Everything is based on cel frames of animation and not using polygonal characters and therefore pixel art to deliver it. This means that performance has to be stuck and locked at 60 FPS on all formats, and that keeps the performance consistent. It also means you can't go above 60 even if you run it on a PC version, and it does have very limited PC options. I was actually quite surprised at how limited it is. You've basically got VSync on or off, you've got the option to improve input latency, and then buffering of frames. That's pretty much it. Aside the one extra option which is shared between consoles and PC, and that's to change the brightness or the luminosity of the screen, which is effectively the brightness, and I can tend to keep it as dark as I can, so around 90 to 110 is a decent level on the screen, and this blends the characters well into the title. The consoles have even less, only giving you the option to change luminosity, and that's pretty much it. So it's a quite limited title on both PC and console, but performance is consistent. It's 60 FPS. Now, the little skips that you see are actually parts of the fact that, it's, like I say, it's animated cell frames, so it doesn't update every frame of animation every 16 milliseconds. That means if there's no movement on screen, there's no flashes of colour, you can get these minor little, what looks like stutters on the frame time graph. It's just that the screen doesn't update. It's intentional, it doesn't drop frames. And as you can see here, looking at the PC running the Afterburner Map Comparisons, you can see that it runs pretty much no performance levels of the GPU. 25% is the maximum I've seen it use of my 5500 XT here, and it uses around 2 or 3% of around 2 or 4 cores at any one time. Their own in-house engine is clearly very efficient, but it keeps 60 FPS, and it really only uses the CPU to animate those frames to cycle through what's in RAM, and then use the algorithms or the routines for the enemy AI to combat you. It's AI, it's routines just like the old game, so it works out where you are and attacks you consistently. But as you can see, it uses hardly any GPU and any CPU performance. This means that doing performance metrics on any console is pointless. You saw the Xbox One S, any dips there are intentional, there's no drops at all. It uses very low levels of performance, and you can see this low utilization by the core rate of my 5500 here. It doesn't really peak above 500 megahertz because it doesn't need it. And the game doesn't go above 60 FPS either, because it is essentially a comic book game style that's limited by the refresh rate of the animation and movesets. And it's as 2D as probably modern games get in the sense of how it's designed and how it's drawn. It's still based on polygonal characters with sprites overlaid images on top of them moving around. Modern graphics GPUs can't handle anything but that, but it really isn't utilising it very well. There's probably hardly any triangles and primitives being used here, and then it just simply slaps on that texture map sample to work out the animation frame relatively. But it doesn't need any of those kind of performance. It means it runs beautifully. This also means that resolution is pointless because the art is designed around the art. It's 1080p base. That means you run it at 4K, it makes no difference at all. It doesn't make the game look any better or any worse. So playing this on everything, even probably the Switch, doesn't actually look that bad. I haven't played it on the Switch, but I'm sure it's the best place to play these types of retro titles on the go or plugged into the screen. It's a great game, and it does have loads of nostalgic touches. One of my favourites is the fact that it allows you to play the game using the retro soundtrack in the menu screen, and that's excellent. And that's the big point to touch on. The whole video up to this point is me waxing lyrical about the musical style. And I think Yozo Koshiro does return and does some good tracks on this title. In fact, you can tell his tracks straight away. The intro sequence is probably one of the best. The character selection screen in the first level, you can instantly, as soon as I played the game, I could tell it was his music. And they're pretty much the best. Now, I'm not saying the rest of the tracks aren't good. They are. They're very, very good. They're not up to the level of ambience and atmosphere that the original game delivers, but it's very hard to try and recreate something that holds such a nostalgic value for people like me and many others watching this video. So I do think that it's a good level. I don't think it's great, but I think it also sums up that music never takes the forefront of titles now like it used to back in the day. And I'm looking forward to games that do that much more, where they actually really create some epic tunes and chip tunes and dance beats and music that this game created. It really works in terms of delivering a modern slant on Streets of Rage, and that I cannot fault it for at all. Music just isn't quite as impactful as it was on the original titles, original 2. But in terms of the Streets of Rage experience, the characters, the models, the game, the gameplay, the level design, the flow, the combat, the combinations, all of that is the best it's ever been. There is no shadow of a doubt this is true to a Streets of Rage title once you play it and get into that gameplay hook. The combat feels satisfying and gratifying, it's impactful, the screen shakes, the characters wobble, there's those pauses, the timings, and it plays with the timings later on. The boss battles are tough but fair, the character flows are sequential but again logical, and it's all about the high score, not about finishing the game. And all of that feels brilliant. Each character's got his strengths. Blaze is the speedy, fast, efficient one. Axel is the all-rounder, the Van Damme. And Floyd, with his cybernetic arms and max inspiration, is the heavy-hitting combat that just decimates everyone in front of him. This mixture of styles really takes me back to the old beat-em-ups of the arcade days and Streets of Rage, Final Fight and all of those titles, as it has that perfect balance between the styles and combat, and you pick the style you prefer to play in. The timings, the parries, the moves, the combos, everything feels so satisfying, and the variety of weapons in the title also ramps that up even more. The risk and reward system by using your combination power up, and if you then draw that power back by hitting enemies or take the risk and get hit, you can die instantly, so you have to balance when you use it and when not to use it. All of this makes it the very best Streets of Rage and possibly the very best urban scrolling beat 'em up I've ever played. It is without a doubt exceptional, and all of the extra elements, the additional characters you can find in the game, the secret hidden areas, the artwork and loads of other things that I don't want to spoil, means that for £20 or Game Pass, if that's what I've played it on, it's definitely worth it. I did have a few issues on the PC. It wouldn't load on the Windows Media or Windows 10 version, and I had a couple of crashes on the Xbox as well where it just went straight back to the dashboard. But this is a DirectX 11 based engine and API that's running across PC and consoles. This is exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about in my previous other videos, where you write once and deploy many. This is designed to run on both the Xbox consoles and the PC without any difference at all. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Steam version, the PS4 and the Switch versions are very different because they're writing to different APIs and operating systems. Therefore, different options are available to the team and the engine connections. And I had a couple of other issues. It did completely dropped to 15 FPS when VSync was on PC when I was playing the game and got an achievement. It only did it once and unfortunately I wasn't capturing it. So these things can be tweaked and improved. I would like to see more menu options as well for the PC. It would be good to enhance that a little more and add a few more options such as the CR filter and other touches on the title, which are always good for retro games like this, which I thought Sonic Mania did an exceptional job of. The art and vibrant colour schemes are exceptional, the graphical flourishes of reflections in puddles, the neon lights, the edge and rim lighting on characters as they walk under objects, and the penumbra percentage closer shadows, though there are some faults with Floyd's arms and other objects like battens where they don't work correctly and look a little odd, but this is nitpicky. The only thing it's missing is to play it on the Megadrive control pad, the only way it's supposed to be. But aside this, there's no reason on earth to not pick it up because it's available on every single platform you could possibly own. And the team have really gone from strength to strength, from Wonder Boy to this, and I can heartily and highly recommend Streets of Rage 4. It's an absolute blast to play and really captures the atmosphere and feeling of those arcade beat-em-ups from days gone by. Anyway, that's it, I'm out. I hope you enjoyed this, but I'll see you on the